February 14th, 1965. The air at Daytona was electric. The crowd thought they were about to watch another classic American stock car race. But by lap 50, something strange happened. Mario Andretti's car wasn't just ahead, it was lapping the field. Fans were confused, broadcasters were scrambling. It looked like the race was already over, and yet it had barely begun. That car wasn't running your average Ford big block. It was powered by something that didn't belong on that track, or maybe anywhere else in American motorsport. The Ford 427 SOHC, also known as the Cammer, wasn't just a new engine, it was a war machine. With its overhead camshaft, timing chain-driven valve train, and 7,500 RPM redline, it wasn't built to compete, it was built to annihilate. Ford didn't just show up to the 1965 Daytona 500, they declared technological war. This wasn't the typical pushrod versus pushrod showdown. This was European-inspired overhead cam precision fused with raw Detroit power. And the result? Ford's 427 SOHC ban would go down as one of the most controversial engine bans in NASCAR history. But here's the twist. After dominating, the engine disappeared. Quietly, no tributes, no trophies on display, no mention in official NASCAR records. The most advanced Ford racing engine ever created. Gone. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. Behind the curtain, powerful forces moved quickly. NASCAR officials, rival companies like Chrysler, and even the US government. The public never saw it coming. Ford's banned V8 engine, once destined to change American performance history, was buried in memos, regulations, and politics. This isn't just a Ford racing scandal. It's a story of how an engine that could have changed the future of muscle cars became a forgotten relic. A buried engine truth that still haunts the archives of American motorsport. So buckle up, because what happened next makes it clear. The Cammer wasn't just too fast for the track, it was too fast for the system to handle. Detroit's secret war, why Ford had to strike. In the early 60s, Sundays were sacred, but not for prayer. For Detroit, Sundays meant war. The kind fought in high-banked ovals, under banners, with screaming engines as weapons. And Ford, they were getting demolished. Chrysler's Hemi was a juggernaut, and GM's mystery motors were rewriting speed charts with terrifying consistency. Ford's boardroom wasn't just embarrassed. They were losing market share, dealer confidence, and most of all, the battle for muscle car dominance. The phrase, win on Sunday, sell on Monday, wasn't marketing fluff, it was survival. Ford needed a miracle. Enter Jacques Pacino, the man who turned engineering anger into innovation. He wasn't some corporate suit. Pacino lived in the garage, bled oil, and knew how to weaponize frustration. While GM and Chrysler stuck to push rods and brute force, Pacino looked to Europe, to timing chains, overhead camshafts, higher rev ceilings, and he fused it with raw American displacement. The result? The Ford 427 SOHC, nicknamed the Cammer, a high-revving 7.0-liter beast with solid lifters, hemispherical combustion chambers, and aluminum valve covers the size of bread loaves. It could breathe like a race-bred Ferrari, but hit like a freight train. On dyno tests, it pushed over 650 horsepower without breaking a sweat, and easily surpassed 700 HP in race trim. Make no mistake, this engine wasn't designed to compete. It was engineered to end Chrysler's Hemi dominance and humiliate anything GM could throw on the track. And it worked. The Cammer didn't just run. It screamed past the field like it had a personal vendetta against the sport itself. But it wasn't just the power that scared Detroit. It was the implications. This was Ford racing innovation on a level NASCAR wasn't ready for. The pushrod versus OHC debate was over. The Cammer was the future, and it arrived decades early. The Ford racing history timeline was about to split in two, before the Cammer and after its quiet execution. What began as Ford's last stand had now become its most dangerous weapon. But the bigger the threat, the bigger the target. And in 1965, the Cammer didn't just win, it made enemies. The kind that don't wear race suits, but suits of another kind altogether. The Cammer dominates, then gets erased. It didn't take long for the Cammer to prove why it scared the life out of Detroit. Once it hit the tracks, it was chaos. Ford 427 SOHC powered cars were devouring lap records like candy. In just 40 races during the 1965 season, the Cammer racked up 32 wins. That wasn't performance, that was a message, and everyone heard it loud and clear. Ford wasn't messing around anymore. Names like Yarborough, Andretti, and David Pearson weren't just winning, they were annihilating the field with Ford's forbidden engine under the hood. The car didn't sound like anything else either. That overhead cam design gave it a distinct, high-revving growl, like something out of Le Mans, not Talladega. Mechanics were stunned, drivers called it unfair, rivals cried foul, And then came the emergency meeting. NASCAR claimed it was about cost parity, that the camera was just too expensive, too exotic for grassroots racing, but leaked memos years later tell a different story. One internal document flat out admitted the Ford 427 SOHC was making rival engines look obsolete. It wasn't banned because it failed. It was banned because it worked too well. That's when the Ford 427 SOHC ban went into effect. Quietly, strategically, NASCAR rewrote its rulebook, banning overhead camshaft engines from competition. The excuse? Leveling the playing field. The reality? Keeping GM and Chrysler in the race, because if they left, so did the money. The irony? That same year, Chrysler's 426 Hemi, just as radical and powerful in its own right, remained legal. Why? Because it had the backing, the politics, and the pressure to stay. Ford, they had the performance, but not the leverage. So, Ford racing history was forcibly rewritten. The camera was scrubbed from official stats, excluded from championship tallies, and omitted from highlight reels. A rare Ford engine, once poised to shift the sport's future, became a ghost in the garage. And just like that, a piece of vintage racing technology, a glimpse into what Detroit muscle cars could have evolved into decades earlier, was erased, not by failure, but by fear, not by breakdown, but by betrayal. But that was just the beginning, because the next chapter of this banned NASCAR engine wasn't written by teams in fire suits, but by men in neckties, government seals, and federal subpoenas. The government gets involved, the real agenda. While NASCAR took the public fall for banning the Ford 427 SOHC, the real dagger came from a different direction, Washington, D.C. Behind the headlines and cost parity excuses, a quiet war was brewing between Detroit and the federal government, and the camera, it became the poster child for everything the bureaucrats feared. In 1966, Congress began targeting automakers for glorifying speed. Senate hearings grilled Detroit executives, accusing them of marketing 150-mile-per-hour muscle cars to teenagers. The SOHC, with its 700-plus horsepower, stood out like a lightning rod. A Ford internal memo from that year called the engine a regulatory liability. The message was loud and clear: tone it down or face consequences. It didn't take long for those consequences to show up in Ford's lobby. Surprise audits from the IRS, Department of Transportation, and Federal Trade Commission hit like synchronized strikes. Budgets were dissected. Race expenses were reclassified as fraudulent. The timing wasn't random. These weren't just routine checks. These were warnings. What triggered it? Some say it was Chrysler lobbyists, furious that Ford had created something so devastating. Others point to GM execs, who had Washington connections and wanted the camera dead before Ford gained too much market edge. But many insiders believe the final straw was Ford's rumored plan to put the SOHC engine into a street car, a limited-run Mustang that could rev to 8,000 RPM and leave Hemis choking in the smoke. That's when the hammer fell. Ford's racing division was gutted. The SOHC program was officially defunded. Projects were shut down. Engineering records were locked away or quietly lost. What could have been the foundation of a new performance revolution, overhead cam engines in consumer cars decades before they were mainstream, was erased from the future. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. It wasn't just the fastest, it was too efficient, too refined, too advanced for an industry terrified of change. So when people ask, why was the Ford 427 SOHC banned, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is, who killed it, and why were they so scared? And the answer? You won't find it in a NASCAR archive. You'll find it in federal tax code revisions, political handshakes, and the unmarked doors of Washington's regulatory offices. What we lost. Innovation 30 years too soon. The day Ford shelved the 427 SOHC wasn't just the end of a racing project. It was the death of America's most advanced engine innovation at the time. The camera wasn't some wild prototype. It was a fully functional, race-tested, dyno-certified monster that could have redefined performance engineering in the United States. But instead of becoming the blueprint for the future, it was buried under bureaucracy, politics, and fear. This was Detroit's first real step toward what the Europeans had already embraced: overhead camshaft efficiency, timing chain durability, high-revving combustion stability. The camera solved engineering problems that would plague American V8s for decades: pushrod flex, valve float, cooling failures, and breathing limitations. All of it solved, and all of it thrown away. Think about what that means. The 1970s oil crisis forced automakers to scramble. We got choked out V8s making 140 horsepower and limp throttle response. But the SOHC, with modern tuning and lighter materials, could have answered that crisis with power and efficiency. Ford had the golden ticket in 1965, a race-proven design that could run cooler, rev higher, and deliver more torque with less fuel. Instead, they pulled the plug. Even the Japanese, who would later dominate global auto markets, built their legends on this very tech. Overhead cam designs in everything from Datsun Z cars to Honda Civics. If the camera had hit the streets, American engine design could have leapfrogged ahead by 3 decades. Instead, it got left behind, clinging to push rods and band-aid fixes. By the time overhead cam engines finally started to appear in American vehicles in the 1990s, it wasn't Ford leading the charge. It was a reluctant adaptation. The camera's DNA lived on in whispers, found in the Ford Coyote V8, the modular engines and modern SOHC platforms, but it was never allowed to wear its crown. We lost more than a race engine. We lost a legacy of Ford racing innovation, a future of high RPM American muscle, and a chance to write a new chapter in engineering history, all because it made the wrong people uncomfortable. It was the engine that could have led, but instead, it became a lesson, one that still echoes in the dyno rooms and private collections of those who know what was taken from us. Resurrection and legacy, the engine they couldn't kill. You can silence the press, shred the memos, and rewrite the rule books, but some machines refuse to die. The Ford 427 SOHC, despite the politics, bans, and bureaucracy, never really disappeared. It went underground, hidden in crates, bolted into drag cars, passed between collectors like a sacred relic, because those who touched it, heard it, or saw what it could do, they never forgot. Only 7 original Daytona-raced SOHC engines are confirmed to still exist. They don't sit in dusty museums. They're guarded like treasure, some locked away in private collections. Others, like one you'll soon see roar back to life on this very channel, are being restored, not just to run, but to remind the world what real engineering sounded like before the rulemakers took control. Today, those engines sell for upwards of $450,000, not because they're rare, but because they represent everything Ford could have become. The Camry is the missing link between classic Detroit iron and the refined performance cars we drive now. You hear echoes of it in the Coyote 5.8, in the timing chain growl of every EcoBoost, in the high-revving OHC-powered GT 350 and GT 500 that came decades later. The Ford 427 legacy isn't just technical, it's spiritual. It's a reminder that in 1965, for a brief moment, Ford beat everyone, not just on the track, but in the lab. It built something that outclassed its rivals in design, durability, and dominance, and they paid the price for being too good, too soon. And yet, despite everything, the Camry survived. Not in the spotlight, not in the record books, but in the hearts of builders, engineers, and fans who refuse to let automotive truth be buried by fear. Because when something is too powerful to be erased, it finds a way to return, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. Fire it up, and you'll know it never really left. This wasn't just a banned race engine, it was a mechanical rebellion, a forbidden V8, and a warning. Suppressing innovation doesn't kill it, it only delays the resurrection. And now, that resurrection begins.